this is where it's very dangerous using translations. You say, but they all agree. Clearly, that's what the original says. I don't know the original language. You say, but they all agree. Well, they all agree because they cribbed off of each other, right? They were copying from each other. Now, maybe they are correct, but you can't assume that just because they all say the same thing. Translations can be copying from each other, and they often do.
You are listening to Hebrew Gospel Pearls with Nehemia Gordon and Keith Johnson. Exploring Hebrew New Testament manuscripts for yesterday, today, and tomorrow.
Shalom and welcome to Hebrew Gospel Pearls, episode 32. Today we're going to be talking about Matthew chapter 5, verses 29 to 30. I'm so excited about this, Keith.
We'll get started. Let's read.
Right. You know, this is actually some verses where we have to talk about the principle of hyperbole, which is a fancy way of saying exaggeration. The fancy way of saying I caught a fish this big. All right, so let's read it.
Okay.
Or at least that's one interpretation.
Let me read the English first.
Oh, yeah.
29 and 30. If your right eye makes you stumble, tear it out and throw it from you, for it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. If your right hand makes you stumble, cut it off and throw it from you, for it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to go into hell.
Okay, what were those two translations you just read?
NASB.
Okay. Well, there were two translations.
No, that was two verses. If your right eye, if your right hand.
Wait a minute. So, okay. 29 has an interesting thing there that I guess I didn't realize until this very moment. V'im yisidcha einecha or eincha hayamin naker ota v'tashlicheha mimeka. If your right eye seduces you, entices you, pluck it out and throw it away from you. In verse 30, v'chem in yisidcha yadcha chatochata. And if your hand entices you, cut it off. Tov lecha shetafsid echad me'evarecha mikol guvcha begehinom. It is better that you should lose one of your limbs than your entire body in hell.
So in the two verses of English, they repeat the...
Yes, so the hell only appears in verse 30, not in verse 29. Now let's look at the manuscripts, because one of the things we did with this and the other sections in this series is look at all the available manuscripts, and I'm looking to see, does hell appear in any manuscripts? I didn't realize that it's missing in verse 29 in the Hebrew, but there in the Greek. And yeah, no, it's not there in the, that's really interesting. It's not in any of the manuscripts in verse 29, only in verse 30. So that's interesting. I don't know that it's all that significant, because you could take the end of verse 30 and say that's a summation of both verses, right? So maybe there's a question of why.
But in the Greek,
repeated?
It's repeated, yes.
Okay. What do we want to start talking about here? I think I want to start with this whole idea of, let's start with the grammatical issue. Can we do that?
Yes, please.
And this will be an opportunity to teach a little bit of Hebrew grammar.
Excellent.
So biblical Hebrew and modern Hebrew, they're Semitic languages, are two dialects of a Semitic language. And Semitic languages are a family that include Arabic and Aramaic and Ge'ez, which is the ancient language of Ethiopia, and Akkadian, which is the ancient language of Iraq, of northern Iraq. Those are all Semitic languages, and there are others. And they are languages in which there is no word for it. So in English, which is a Germanic language, there are three genders. And I don't mean like gender like in New York City where there's like 32 genders. I mean grammatical genders. That word's been hijacked by people with an agenda. And leaving that agenda aside, the word gender has referred to a grammatical concept that exists in many languages. There are words that may not be male or female, but they're the male gender, the female gender, and grammatically they're treated as male and female. So English has three genders, male, female, and what's called neuter. So that's he, she, and it. But Semitic languages only have two genders, male and female. And every word, every noun in the language is either male or female. So in English, there are things that are neither male or female, like pencil.
Right.
Pencil isn't male or female,
Cup.
It's neuter. Cup is it. Pencil is it. Ship is sometimes it, but sometimes it's she. And a car is sometimes she in English, right? Or a boat would be she. But in Hebrew, every single noun has a gender, male or female. And why is that important? Because we see this in Hebrew Matthew here, there's a bit of confusion. It says, V'im yisitcha encha, hayamin nakerota. If your right eye entices you, pluck it out. And literally so let's start with the verb. Entices is a verb, and it's a verb that's in the future form. And in most of the manuscripts, it's yisitcha, and in two of the manuscripts, it's hesitcha. Doesn't matter. All the manuscripts have the verb as masculine. But then the pronoun is naker ota, pluck her out. What's her? Referring to the eye. Now, is I masculine or is I feminine? We'll save that for a second. We're going to come back to that. There's three manuscripts, W, A, and J, which are very, very closely related to each other. And all three of them, instead of pluck her out, they have pluck him out. So they treat I as masculine, not only in the verb, which all the manuscripts do, but also in the pronoun. And then it says, v'tashlicheha, and throw her away, in most of the manuscripts, except in W, A, and J, where it has v'tashlichehu, throw it away. So what is going on? Why is there a confusion about the gender of ayin, of the Hebrew word for I? And what this has to do with, and look, this could be something that happened in transmission, right? Let's say this was written in the first century. That doesn't mean that this confusion was there in the first century. It's been transmitted by scribe copying, scribe after scribe after scribe copying. And some of those scribes were not speakers of Semitic languages. Hebrew ceased to be a spoken language, probably for most Jews, in the 2nd or 3rd century CE. And then the last vestiges of spoken Hebrew as a native language were probably from the 9th or 10th century. It continued as a spoken language of scholars throughout history. It never ceased. But when you're speaking a language as a scholar, it's not your native language. There are things from your native language that bleed over, that spill over into the scholarly language. And one of those things could be this issue of gender. So I'm going to open up here a grammar. This is a grammar it's called Hebrew Grammar by Livni and Kochba. It's a modern grammar, but it applies to a large extent to biblical Hebrew. And this aspect of it does. And it says, Lashem shnei minim. The noun has two genders, zachar u'nekeva, masculine and feminine. And basically it then explains that every word that's not feminine is masculine. So first we just need to know which the words are that are masculine.
Right.
So the most common rule, I don't need to read Livni and Kochba for this, the most common rule that most Hebrew speakers and people who learn Hebrew know is that anything that ends in in kamatz he, not just any the that is represented by the vowel kamatz, is 98%, 99% of those are going to be masculine, are going to be feminine. So Torah ends with kamatz he, and Torah is feminine. Isha, woman, ends with kamatz he, Isha is feminine. Most words that end in kamatz he are feminine. There are exceptions. And that's where things get a bit confusing, right? So generally, kamatz he, the ending, is feminine, and not kamatz he is masculine, except for all the exceptions. There are things that end in kamatz he that are masculine, and there are things that don't end in kamatz he that are feminine. And the word for is an example of a word that does not end in kamatz he, right? It's not aina, it's ayin, but it's still feminine. So here are the rules that Livni and Kochba give. And the thing about kamatz he, that is there as, let's see, that's rule, it's way at the end, right? First they bring all the exceptions, and then they, let's see, then they give the standard rule, right? So the standard rule of kamatz he here is clause number 4. So it says nouns that end in he with the emphasis at the end of the word, or with tav, which is not from the root. And they bring examples, menorah, candelabrum, or menorah. Right? We say in English menorah, but it's menorah, with the emphasis on the and it's kamatz he. Mitzvah, commandment. Machberet, so machberet doesn't end in kamatz he, but it has this extra added tav, which also indicates the feminine when it's not part of the root. And then they bring the example zavit, angle, where the tav is also expressing the feminine. So that's the standard rule. The most common one is kamatzhe. There's other ones with tav, like machberet. And then you have the exceptions, which is what he starts with. So rule number 1, the nouns city, country, and the names of cities, countries, and the earth are all feminine. So Jerusalem is feminine. Why is Jerusalem feminine? Because that's the rule, right? It's an exception to the rule, but it's such a common exception. It's such a consistent exception that it's the rule now. It's its own rule. Egypt, feminine. Cities and countries are all feminine. Rule number 2, and this is a very interesting, I learned this in kindergarten. Literally, this rule I learned in kindergarten. So it is the names of body parts that exist in pairs in living beings are feminine. And there's one exception that I'm not going to share on the program. But one of you figure it out for yourself. It's something men have and women don't. And it exists in pairs. So ozen is ear. So you don't say ozen shomea, you say ozen shomat, right? The ear hears, and the verb is in the feminine. Or you can say oznaim gdolot, big ears in the feminine, as opposed to oznaim gdolim, which would be an error. Ayin, eye. So that's one of the examples. And kanaf, wings. So it's not just human body parts. Okay. And then it's rule number 3 is the name of objects that have the plural, that exist in a plural form. And what is that? That exists in a dual form. So let's back up for a second. We said there's 2 genders in Hebrew and Semitic languages, masculine and feminine. How many numbers are there in English? Meaning, and by numbers I mean singular, plural, right? You just have 2, right? Hebrew has 3, singular, dual, and plural. Dual. So Semitic languages have a dual, right? So Mitzrayim, the Hebrew word for Egypt, doesn't mean the Egypt, it actually means the 2 Egypts, because it has the plural ending. And what are the 2 Egypts? Upper and lower Egypt. Okay, so, and you say the same thing about eyes. Einayim is 2 eyes. The ayim ending is plural, is dual. So the Hebrew word for shoes is na'alayim. So the ayim there tells you it's feminine for this object. Okay, so with all that, why is there this confusion, and I'm just going to call it a mistake in Hebrew Matthew, at least in some of the manuscripts of Hebrew Matthew, most of the manuscripts, because the person who copied this manuscript wasn't a native Hebrew speaker, and he saw the word ayin, which doesn't end in kamatzhe, doesn't have a tav at the end, and he got confused and assumed it was masculine, although he knew it was feminine, because the verb is, so this is why I say it's confused. The verb is masculine, but then the 2 pronouns are feminine. So he knows it's feminine, but he's getting confused because he sees this word that has a masculine appearance, and when he copies it, he makes a mistake, right? And then you have W, A, and J, which are consistent and treated as masculine. That's what I would call a hypercorrection. What's a hypercorrection? A hypercorrection is when you know the way you write or speak is a mistake, and so you correct it, but you don't know exactly what the rule is, or you don't always apply the rule correctly, and so you correct it even when it's not wrong. So I love this example of hypercorrection, which is in American English, we have the letter H, and we say house, hill, horn, horse. Well, in certain countries where they speak English and in certain areas, they say aus, ors, ill, right? They don't pronounce the H. And then people come along from those cultures and they say, well, I know we're mispronouncing this as opposed to, quote, standard English, whatever that is. And so they put in an H where it doesn't belong. So they'll say house, hill, and then they'll say herb for herbs. And then they'll call the letter H, right? Because we know we drop it. So now whenever we drop the H sound, we put it in. So they say, so that's a hypercorrection. And it's such a hypercorrection that in some dialects of English, it's standard to say H, right? But it started as a hypercorrection. So this is a hypercorrection, right? The scribe knows that there's a mistake here. And so he changes, or he doesn't know it's a mistake, right? He thinks it's supposed to be masculine, I suppose. And he changes it, ota, her, to oto for I. So all of that is this grammatical, the grammatical issue that shows you the complexity of these manuscripts. You have a mistake, which is almost in all the manuscripts, and you have somebody who corrects the mistake thinking he's fixing it, but actually makes it worse, right? So now he doesn't have the mistake once, he has it 3 times. He has it both in the verb, but then he also has it in the 2 pronouns. You know, pluck her out and pluck him out and throw him away, but I is feminine. All right, I know that's a bit esoteric perhaps, but it gives us some of the complexity of dealing with these manuscripts and why it's so important to look at the big picture of all the different manuscripts. So I'm going to let you lead off the next issue.
Well, so when we see this, I did want to ask you this question. We actually split this when we did this series first time through. This was 1 episode.
Yeah.
We had the connection between what happens in terms of adultery, which went to desiring, which meant hand, and these next 2 verses are related to those things causing you to do the same kind of thing, which could be to covet.
Right.
Meaning all 4. But we separated. Now why did we separate?
Well, and in Hebrew, you could say it's even more connected because we have this discussion, frankly, of sex, of the sexual coveting, and then we have the verb in verse 29 and 30, and forget the issue that it's the wrong gender, right? But the verb is to entice.
Exactly.
Which could have a sexual connotation in Hebrew.
Yes.
Right? So your eye is enticing you and your hand is enticing you. It's enticing. And this is actually a metaphor throughout the Tanakh where sin is described in sexual terms. It talks about your eye prostituting. It leads you astray into prostitution, or the eye prostitutes, meaning it's looking after other gods. Right? The way maybe a man's eye might look after a prostitute. So instead of a prostitute, you're looking after another god, right? So there is this sexual connotation or metaphorical usage, I suppose, in biblical Hebrew that's being used here as well. So they're connected, no doubt.
Okay. 27
and 28 and 29 and 30 are a unit, but we broke them apart. First of all, because we had more to say in 27 and 28 than we could even get to.
Yes.
And then a whole bunch more in 29 and 30.
Yeah.
But also because it's a subunit, right? So here it's talking about different body parts if they cause you to stumble in the Greek, or I think it is, but they entice you, then get rid of them.
Yes.
Right? So 29 and 30 are this subunit, right? And you could say it's a continuation of 27 and 28, right? You're looking after something, okay? You've committed adultery in your heart by coveting it, by looking at it with your eye and then coveting it. And so now even get rid of that body part, right? So that is the connection. It is a continuous thought, but it's also a sub-thought here, right? It doesn't have to be, in this case, the eye is looking at a woman. The eye could be looking at an idol. The eye could be looking at somebody else's property that you want to steal. Yeah. The eye could be looking at all kinds of things that you want to do, and the hand as well.
Could steal, the hand could do either action of that.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
Now, so one thing I want to bring here is, which is very interesting. Nelson pointed this out when we were doing the study. So Delitzsch and Salkinson and Ginsburg, which are true translations, they both use another word, which is different than Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew for entice. Right? So they have, Delitzsch has Ve'imya, and again, maybe this is not what Delitzsch has, but it's the version of Delitzsch that I have access to
Study
right
partners
now.
will let us know.
Yeah, exactly. Post it in the comments if you pull up a version of Delitzsch or of Salkins and Ginsburg, and your text has something else. Okay, maybe there's more in one edition. Maybe my edition has a corruption in it, it's possible. Delitzsch has Ve'im yadcha hayemanit tachshilcha katzetzotza v'hashlech mimcha. If your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away from you. And we have there a play on words. We have a word pun between tachshilcha and hashlech. Right? It's what we call metathesis. The order of the letters are switched, but they sound similar, tachshilcha and v'hashlech. And I'm quite certain that Delitzsch, when he translated it that way from the Greek, he wanted it to sound more beautiful and maybe even be more memorable. So he introduced a word pun that's not there in Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew. Salkinson Ginsburg, Ve'im yadcha yemanit tachshilcha katzitzeha v'hashlicheha mimeka. So it's even clearer in Salkins and Ginsburg, the word pun, tachshilcha and v'hashlicheha. Same two words. And I gotta wonder, I don't even wonder, it's quite clear to me that they're consulting, one is consulting the other. Based on the way this is written, it seems too much of a coincidence that they're using the same verbs. It could be a coincidence. Now here's an example where we have a word pun, which isn't in the original, at least in the Shem Tov Hebrew, Matthew Hebrew. Let's look in the Greek, actually. Now I'm curious, because I don't remember. Is there a word pun in the Greek, and maybe they're trying to reproduce something in the Greek? That could be the case. So Matthew 5:29. So the word for causes you to sin is what we have in the Greek. Oh, it's skandalize.
That's right.
It scandalizes you. Or
Right.
it's the word, we get the word scandal.
Right.
The reason that's interesting is that in the Catalan, the translator the Catalan Hebrew Gospels, EBR 100 in the Vatican, the translator into Hebrew didn't know how to translate this word. So he just wrote escandalizats, which is what's in the Catalan and the Greek, and a similar thing in the Greek and in the Latin. So, all right. So we have skandalizats, and then to throw it away is, excele. So there really isn't any kind of word pun. Bale, kai bale aposu, and throw it away from you. So take it and throw it away from you is what it says. So there's no word pun there in the in the Greek, but there is in Delitzsch and in Salkins and Ginsburg. And so here's an example where you got to be careful with word puns. Just because there's a word pun doesn't mean it's a Hebrew original. Nobody claims, as far as I know, that Delitzsch is the original Hebrew text, because Delitzsch tells us he translated it from Greek. And Salkins and Ginsburg not only tells us that he translated it from Greek, Salkinson tells us why he did it, because he found this very bad Hebrew translation in a bookshop, and he said, boy, we can do better than this.
Do you think they were being creative with the word pun?
Absolutely. They were trying to beautify the text. Right? They know about Hebrew word puns because they were great Hebrew scholars, and they're trying to make it flow better and sound nicer. So one or two Hebrew word puns could just be the work of the translator trying to beautify the text. It could also be a coincidence. So we have an example of a coincidence of a word pun in Genesis chapter 1. Right? So it says, she was called woman, Isha, because she was taken from Ish. Okay, so Isha comes from the word Ish. And she was called Isha because it's the feminine of the word Ish, the word for man. Well, it works in English too, right? She was called woman because she was taken from man. Happens to work in English, so that's a coincidence, right? So you could have a text that's full of word puns and it not be original to that language. It could be that the word puns were introduced by a translator. So you got to be very careful with the word puns. We definitely have Hebrew texts of the New Testament where there are word puns in the Hebrew and not in the original Greek, or Greek that we know it was translated from in most cases, or Latin in some cases it was translated from, or in that case it was translated from Catalan. And there are no word puns in the original language that it was translated from, and the word puns were introduced there because they're such an inherent part of Hebrew writing. So you got to be very careful about word puns, and assuming if you find 1 or 2 or even 10 word puns, that you have a text that was written in Hebrew.
Like Petros was a rock, you mean like that kind of thing?
Well, so you have a word pun there both in the Hebrew and the Greek. But, and let's assume that it was spoken in Hebrew, right?
Okay.
That's an assumption. Say assumption.
Assumption.
If we assume it was spoken in Hebrew and that Yeshua said to Peter, you are a rock, Even, and Evneh, I will build my house of prayer upon you, is what it says in Hebrew Matthew, or some form of that in the original that was actually spoken, then the Greek is trying to reproduce that word pun. It says, oh, there's a word pun here. Let me express that in a way that my readers will understand it, because they don't know Hebrew. Or if they know Hebrew, they're not going to, we have to go to a dictionary to figure out what this word is.
Right.
Let's reproduce that in the target language. So there you have a word pun both in the Hebrew, this is Matthew, I think 16, both in the Hebrew and the Greek. And that's actually cited as a proof that Matthew was written in Greek, because it has a word pun. Well, one word pun doesn't prove it. Gotta have a lot. And you want the word puns to really be interwoven with the text, to be an inherent part of the text. The text doesn't really make sense without them. This makes sense without it. But it's interesting that we have the word pun in Delitzsch, we have the word pun in Salkinson and Ginsburg, and we don't have it in Shem Tov Hebrew Matthew, and we don't have it in the Greek. So it's a beautiful example of the word pun being introduced into the text by the translator for the purpose of, I guess, making it more beautiful. So Catalan, EBR 100, it says, and I want to show this is actually kind of cool.
Okay.
So we decided to look at the Catalan. The Catalan has the word ta scandaliza in this verse. And ta or te scandaliza, according to Hames, who is an expert in Catalan, I'm not, he says it's actually two words. Te scandaliza is the something to the effect of leads astray or something like that, right? So it's the it, is the te there. So it's clearly not a Hebrew word. It's a Catalan. It's two Catalan words written as a single Hebrew word.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. So we looked at that, and we found something really interesting in the Catalan, which is a bit surprising. And let me pull it up here. So we found, first of all, there's the word. Actually, it's a different verse. Sorry. Here. So he says, "Aval im eincha yemanit." If your right eye, te scandaliza, it scandalizes you or causes you to stumble, hotzia v'hachika mimcha, take it out and make it far from you, or cause it to be far from you. So what's interesting there is the word, is this word here in the second line, encha. It was originally written with a yud after the nun, making it enecha, your eyes. And then the scribe came along and he put a little line over the yud to erase it. That was a way of saying this yud is a mistake. It's not the plural enecha, your eyes. It's encha, your eye. And then just to bring home the point and make sure you knew to ignore that second yud, he added vowels, right? Because there's different vowels for your eyes versus your eye. So this is interesting. What's really interesting is that Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew, in most manuscripts, has enecha in the plural, your eyes. Some of the manuscripts, they correct it and make it your eye, but most have your eyes, which is a mistake. And I have to wonder here if the Catalan didn't have access to Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew and brought over this error from Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew into the Catalan, and it was then corrected independently both in Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew in some manuscripts and in the Catalan. Possibility, don't know.
When we go to the plus, can we talk about how deep the possibilities go? I mean, when you say, I mean, is that a legitimate?
Well, if it was just this example, I wouldn't even bring this up. But there's other examples that show connections between the Catalan and Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew.
Really?
That look, we saw a similar thing just now with Salkinson, Ginsburg, and Delitzsch. And off the top of my head, I don't remember which one's earlier. I want to say that Delitzsch is earlier. Obviously, or I shouldn't say obviously, if we find more examples like this, like where they're using the same word pun that they've introduced to the text, you're left with the conclusion that one saw the work of the other.
Wow.
And said, I'm not going to start from scratch. Look, this happens every day. When they do the New Revised Standard Version, they don't start with a blank page. They start with the Revised Standard Version. Sure. And when they do the Revised Standard Version, they don't start with a blank page. They start with an earlier revision of the King James Version, right? And the King James didn't start with a blank page. They started with Tyndale's translation. So if you go through all those translations, and this is where it's very dangerous using translations, you say, but they all agree. Clearly, that's what the original says. I don't know the original language, you say, but they all agree. Well, they all agree because they cribbed off of each other, right? They were copying from each other. Now, maybe they are correct, but you can't assume that just because they all say the same thing. Translations can be copying from each other, and they often do. So it's very, very interesting things here. I really want to talk about what this verse means because we didn't even get to that, right? What is the significance of these verses? Is it really telling you to pluck out your eye? That's the literal meaning. Is it really telling you to cut off your hand? That's the literal meaning. We're going to, in the Plus episode, explore some other possibilities.
So we had a conversation. We are in prayer, continuing to be in prayer, because this episode for our public folks brings us again to another not ending point in terms of what we're doing, but in terms of where we're at right now. So Nehemia, what do you see? How do you see this? What's our hope? What's our prayer? What would we like to see happen?
We're going to continue in the Plus episode and talk about really what this verse means and how to explain this. And there's a few possibilities. One of the possibilities I never even imagined, but it was brought up by one of the scholars, and I'm like, wow, that's intriguing. And could be correct. We're going to talk about that in the Plus episode, which if you support McCourt Hebrew Foundation, you can go over and log into nehemiaswall.com and get access to all the Plus episodes that are on my website. Some of them are on your site.
All the evens.
The odd ones, the ones that are odd, are on Keith's website. He's an odd guy. And I'm the even guy. I'm all straight and even. And the even ones are on nehemiaswall.com. So go over, get the Plus episodes, get also other support, what I call support team studies. We just did this amazing study on what I call the lying pen of the scribe.
Oh.
It's one of the most important studies I've ever done.
Really?
It clarifies one of the most difficult verses in the Tanakh. Probably you could say textually one of the most problematic verses. In a very broad sense textually, it's one of the most problematic verses. And I would have never guessed the answer. Once I found what I think the correct answer is from a rabbi in the 17th, 18th century, I was like, how come I didn't think of this? This is so obvious. That's over on nehemiaswall.com.
Wait a minute. You said, so wait, so you're telling me that there are presentations on Nehemia's Wall that you call what?
Support team studies.
Beyond the Plus.
Absolutely.
So you got,
the Plus is included for me in the support team studies for people who support McCourt Hebrew Foundation.
So if you support, you become...
It's a gift for those people to get access to that.
And you have all these other presentations.
Oh, yeah. Lots of teachings. Yeah.
You know, you used to laugh at me years ago when I told you about the premium content library. He used to laugh at me, but you know what?
Keith was a visionary.
I was a visionary. I was ahead of it. Now I just got to get caught up in Nehemia. But it is wonderful because what we want to do is tell people, because of your support, you have access to everything that's on both sites. You have access to things when you're a premium content library member. You have access when you're...
If you support.
If you support, yes, absolutely.
Situations. Yeah.
So hopefully you all do that.
All right. Can you pray?
Yes. Father, thank you for this opportunity and thank you for this this section of Hebrew Gospel Pearls that we have been in here for these last 5 to 6 episodes. 6 episodes. We just ask that you will continue to inspire people, motivate people, and that we'll do everything that we can to help them have an encounter with the language, history, and context of the words of Yeshua.
And Father, I ask you to put a blessing upon all those who have supported what I'm doing, what Keith is doing, that allows us to share this episode and this information, which with a much, much broader audience. We were able to do this and prepare this information and share it with the world because of those people who you've put it upon their hearts to support what we're doing. And I'm so grateful for that. Amen.
Amen.
You have been listening to Hebrew Gospel Pearls with Nehemia Gordon and Keith Johnson. For a more in-depth study, check out Hebrew Gospel Pearls Plus at nehemiaswall.com and bfainternational.com. Thank you for your support.